My name is Joe Hale. I'm the director here at the Dreamland, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us on a beautiful day on Nantucket. Thanks for coming out. As part of our Page to Stage series, which is a series we do in the summer, the proceeds from this benefit our children's theater program, which runs year-round. Also this week, before I introduce our speaker tonight and our moderator tonight, tomorrow night we have David Gregory, who is a CNN political contributor and also former moderator of the press. David's going to be talking about his book, How's Your Faith? On Thursday night we have Ben Mesrick. Ben Mesrick wrote The Social Network, which was then made into a movie and nominated for 8 Academy Awards. He's written several books. He's got a fascinating new book, though, that's out called Mammoth. And it's the story of a project at MIT where they extracted DNA from a woolly mammoth, prehistoric woolly mammoth, from ember, and they say they're replicating a prehistoric creature. And it's also already been optioned for a film. But Ben he's a fascinating individual, and I think the story is interesting too. And then, of course, if you're around at Thanksgiving, on Saturday night at Thanksgiving, Vice President Joe Biden is going to be speaking about his new book, so tickets are on sale for that too. Thank you very much for being here. You're going to have a fascinating next hour plus. Mark Tercek is an entrepreneur. He's taking a new way of looking at many environmental items, aspects of our world, and we're also very lucky to have Natalie Jacobson. As many of you know, Natalie had a distinguished, award-winning 35-year career as a broadcast journalist in Boston, and she is here to lead us through this discussion this evening. So let me introduce Natalie Jacobson and our special guest, Mark Tercek.
Thank you.
Mark is Mr. Green. You don't mind my calling you that. He is the CEO of the Nature Conservancy. Before that, he was one of those financial wizards, happened to work for that little company called Goldman Sachs in New York. And he will tell us the story of how he moved from that world to this. And together with a fellow by the name of Jonathan Adams, who helped co-write this book, he talks about investing in nature, which is an interesting concept. We think about saving nature and keeping clean water and our air and so forth. So this is an almost revolutionary way, I'd say, of thinking about our current state and our earth and how we move forward and live with it. So please welcome Mark Tercek. Before we get to the meat of what you do and the Conservancy, give us a sense of why you moved from the financial world into the world of nature.
Okay. By the way, thank you everybody for coming. I know Nantucket's a nice place to be outdoors. So.
And you have a home here?
Yeah. So I'm impressed that you guys would all, come inside at 5 o'clock to hear me. Thank you very much, and thanks Natalie for interviewing me.
We're happy you're
So my story, I think it actually is. Maybe interesting because I think the moral of my little story is there's an inner environmentalist in everyone. So most of my life I was kind of a city person, and I would go outside for things like as a kid to play basketball or shovel snow, and later on to ski and things like that. But I was never really an environmentalist by any measure, nor was my wife Amy. And then and mostly we lived in cities. And then we started having a family, and as parents, we thought we should get our kids introduced to the great outdoors. So we started doing sort of local nature weekends. Then we went on some eco trips, and we were kind of geeky, so we always paid close attention to the guides. And all of us, including me, we all kind of fell in love with nature and how ecosystems work. And I think most people exposed to nature would be the same way. And then I was a business person, and as a business person, I always thought, I still think business can be a force for good. Businesses are really powerful when they're well run and good at getting things done. So I got very interested in this idea of business as a way to address the climate change challenge and other environmental challenges. But then there I was at Goldman Sachs, still sort of not sure exactly how to transition from that world to this one. And I don't expect any sympathy, but it is kind of tricky to make these transitions. Then I decided, after thinking about it for a long time, that I was just going to do it. So I went to see my boss, who was Hank Paulson at the time. Then he was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. And I said, Hank, I'm going to quit to become an environmentalist. And he said, oh, tell me more about your plans. And Hank actually, in contrast to me, was a pretty savvy environmentalist, involved in lots of nonprofits and things like that. And Hank is a very direct guy. So when he heard my plans, he said, those plans don't sound very good to me. He said, I have a better idea. Stay at Goldman Sachs and build an environmental effort for Goldman Sachs. So this was in late 2005. So he was kind of right. My own strategy wasn't that well developed, so I stayed. And it was really, I did that for a few years. And at that time, it was a kind of a novel thing for an investment bank to do this stuff.
Still would be.
Well, no, it's more common now.
Really?
But then the idea we had was we would look for so-called win-wins, things that Goldman Sachs or our clients could do that would be good for the environment and also good for their business. And the more we looked, it seemed to me, the more we found. So I got really enthusiastic. And then the Nature Conservancy job opened. I really admired the Nature Conservancy. A search firm called me, not to recruit me, to be clear, but they thought I might have some ideas on who would be good to recruit. And I said, yes, I do have one.
Me.
And I nominated me, and they were very polite. This was early 2008, something like that. And then I think mostly I was very fortunate. I got the job, so it's been really exciting adventure and very fulfilling.
It's interesting, and you're right. It's hard to make that transition from one thing to another, especially one so different than that. But give a sense, in case many of us don't know, what the Conservancy is. What does it do? What is its mission?
Okay, thanks. So there are many great environmental nonprofit organizations. In fact, there are a bunch right here in Nantucket, and I urge you to support them. We do. But the Nature Conservancy, what's distinct about us? We're 65 years old. We're very big. So size isn't everything, but size can be important. So we're super big. We have 4,000 people on our team. We have a chapter in every state across the US, and we operate in 72 countries around the world. So we're big. We were formed by scientists, and so we've always been a science-based organization. We're really doubling down on our investment in science now. We've always been nonpartisan. We really started as a US-based land trust. So a lot of our supporters originally chose to support us not because they thought of themselves so much as environmentalists, but they wanted to protect some specific place. So by the standards of environmental nonprofits, we're quite nonpartisan and have kind of diverse ownership. And then we're kind of deal-oriented. Again, it goes back a little bit to our land bank startup. And in this way, it's not so crazy for a former investment banker to be leading the Nature Conservancy. We're sort of deal-oriented. We're good at working with business. We do lots of deals on our own account. So that's who we are. We say, to keep it simple, we try to do three things. We protect nature, we transform how society uses nature, and we inspire people to care about nature. So protect, transform, inspire. By protect, we mean we'll often swoop in and use our own balance sheet to do something very big that no one else otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So,
like what?
So a good example, about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now, some 160,000 acres of land came up for sale in the states of Montana and Washington. One seller, Plum Creek. It was an independent REIT at the time. The land was so-called checkered board acreage. So it was land that President Lincoln gave to the Burlington Northern Railroad. Plum Creek, the seller, was a spinoff of the railroad. And so you'd have an acre here, an acre here, an acre here, but otherwise it was protected acreage. And from a science perspective or ecosystem perspective, really precious. For example, all of the animals that were there when Lewis and Clark visited it are still there. So there were 160,000 acres suddenly for sale. But really, the opportunity was to protect millions of acres. The purchase price was about $150 million. So there were no other conservation buyers, only us. But even for us, that's a big deal.
And you bought it because to save it, to
we
preserve
bought it to ensure that, well, the other competing buyers were developers, and that land would have all been developed, mostly very nice second homes, but that development would have had a very negative impact on that bigger ecosystem.
So when you buy a big piece of land like that, what are you thinking? We're just going to leave it pure the way it is, or
not
you also
exactly.
Have to consider maintaining it, right?
Yes, well, that for sure it has to be maintained, and then another consideration is we've got to recover our capital. I mean, we're just a humble nonprofit. We're a big one, but we're not that different than any other nonprofit, big or small. At the beginning of every year, our annual budget is $750 million. So we've got to raise a lot of money just to operate, those 4,000 people all over the world. So if we're going to invest $150 million in land like we did, we then have to, as best we can over time, recover that capital so we can play again.
How do you
so
do
again,
that? How do
we're
you
kind
do
of a
that?
merchant bank for nature. So the best thing to do is to sell that land to conservation-friendly buyers. So the best conservation-friendly buyer has been the federal government. They've actually been a very wise, they have their critics, of course, but broadly, they've been a very wise buyer. We're a little bit nervous about where that stands right now. States have also been very good buyers. But then there's other things you could do. You could sell big acreage to somebody and put an easement on most of that and let them have a little home on one corner of it. There's those kinds of things. We wouldn't be opposed, it wouldn't be our top first pick, but we wouldn't be opposed to sustainable timber operations. Because again, so back to my protect strategy, we're trying to do things at scale. It's a big world, time's not on our side, and so we're not purist, I suppose I should say. We buy that land, and then we want to recover our capital and have it taken care of as best we can. But one thing about that last deal, the reason I mention it, because I'm sure there are some financial people here, another cool thing we did in that deal is $150 million to go out and raise in donations. Like, that's a big ask. We already have to raise a lot just to keep the lights on. So we borrowed 95% of that money as so-called impact capital. So by impact capital, we mean investor-provided capital, this time in the form of loans, at way below market terms. But those investors would get their money back, some financial return, and a huge environmental return.
When you sold the land.
Yes, one way or another, we got to pay that money back. And then only 5% of the money came from donors. So if you were a donor, if I asked you for $1, I could tell you that 95 other dollars would match your dollar with low-cost capital. So we kind of did an LBO for nature. Back to my old life. So that's the protect strategy. I know this is going too long. But then let me just quickly shift to transform. Even if we're clever, like I just described, I thought that was pretty clever.
It's very clever.
We'll never raise enough money to buy enough stuff to save the world. It's too big a world. There's too much to do. So by transform, and this is really the newest work we're emphasizing, here, instead of using our financial capital, we use our intellectual capital, our know-how, our science, and our experience. And we try to change how science and business works so that they'll understand that doing the right thing for nature is often the right thing for an economy or for a business.
An example there?
An example there would be, here's a great one, I think, what we call water funds.
Sorry?
Water funds. So the first one we did is in Quito, Ecuador. So the capital city of Quito, fast-growing city, but middle-income kind of city. Population's growing, so the city was concerned, how will we be sure we'll have enough clean water for our growing population? So the municipal water company was about to build plant and equipment, new facilities to clean water that had become dirty. Our local team said, no, don't do that. Instead, protect the upstream watershed. Spend a smaller amount of money altering farming practices, ranching practices, planting trees, these kinds of things. That will secure the clean water you need at a lower cost. There will also be all these environmental benefits that go with that, protecting those ecosystems. And there'll be community benefits too, because it'll have to work for those upstream communities. So it's kind of win-win-win. The water company saves money. And so philanthropic requirement there is almost zero, just our team, our little startup capital. And then we said, boy, this is so great, conservation that pays for itself. Let's do our best to replicate it. So now we have about 40 of those water funds across Latin America, and we're doing it in Africa. But even more importantly, we're giving that know-how away to engineering companies, the World Bank, academics, et cetera, because again, we're not a for-profit. We don't have to hoard our best ideas, but we do want massive restoration of nature to protect watersheds, but then importantly also to sequester carbon. So that's our transform strategy. The last thing I'll say about that then is sometimes, it's kind of diminished recently, but in my early days at TNC, when we ramped this up, we used to get a lot of heat, and even some of it would be made personal. Why is TNC working with companies like Dow Chemical, a company with a big environmental footprint? Why you should never work with them? We said, no, it's because they have a big environmental footprint is exactly why we want to work with them, and we want to help them understand how doing things in a more positive way will be good for their business and the environment. And if we prove that, other companies will imitate that.
So,
all that's going quite well.
So did you come up with an idea for Dow?
This is interesting, too. the Dow project, it was in my early days at TNC, so I'll admit, in hindsight, I was kind of naive. So I had kind of in mind that mighty TNC would come down from the mountaintop and show Dow the enlightened way forward. So the team was TNC scientists and Dow engineers. So then we got to work. These collaborations are really interesting and hugely productive, but a little bit tricky. So we put together our first team, and then Andrew Liveris, who's the CEO of Dow, and I think a really good leader, he made a bold commitment for this project. He called me up and said, Mark, it doesn't sound like the project's gotten off to such a good start. And it turns out of the initial scientists that we appointed to this project, some were of more old-fashioned environmentalists who were, didn't want to work with Dow scientists, Dow engineers. So we changed our team around and had a happy team, got to know one another, engineers and scientists. Then we, going into it, had this idea that we could restore the coastal ecosystems at Dow's huge manufacturing facility in Freeport, Texas. At the time, it was the biggest manufacturing facility of any kind in America. I don't know if that's still true. It's right on the Gulf. And of course, the Dow plant managers were very concerned about incidences of extreme weather, sea level rise, and the risks that would pose to the facility. So our team said, what are you going to do about that? And they said, we're going to build seawalls. Our team said, no, instead of seawalls, we should restore the marshes, the mangroves, et cetera. It's sort of like the water fund. Those ecosystems at lower costs will provide the protection you need. So then the Dow guys said, sure, let's study it. It turns out in that case it didn't work. So there was a little bit of panic about that too, but I said, no, it's good to know what works and what doesn't work. And it wasn't anyone's fault why it didn't work. It just so happened that the manufacturing facility wasn't located in the right place where those ecosystems could be restored.
So did they build the wall?
They're building, basically in that case, they have no choice but wall. But then, this is cool. Now the TNC scientists and the Dow engineers have become kind of friends. They've gotten to know one another. This is really an important lesson for these hyper-partisan times in America. And they're now, they trust one another, they're sharing everything. So it turns out that Dow plant is being expanded because natural gas prices have become low. That's an important feedstock for the plant. And so our scientists learned that Dow is about to put in all these new scrubbers in their chimneys to deal with local ozone issues. And these ozone challenges are challenges for manufacturing facilities all over the world. So then our scientists say, hey, we have a different idea. Why don't we do massive reforestation in an area that needs reforestation, by the way?
That means planting trees?
Planting trees, massive numbers of trees. And our team said, we think it will cost less, it will address your ozone issue, and again, the environmental benefits and community benefits will be huge. So we studied that. This has been published now in peer-reviewed journals. The EPA still hasn't given us the green light, but we have, because of the partnership, TNC scientists, I don't think, would have thought of this all by themselves, nor would Dow have thought of it all by themselves. We have a new way to address ozone pollution all around the world, saves money and restores nature, and sequesters carbon.
So I'm hearing you have a great idea and you've got brilliant minds who are coming up with this thing, but just the way the marshes didn't work along the shore for Dow. When you come up with a new idea that isn't tested, how do you test it? Do you take a small area and plant trees to prove that your idea works? How do you do that?
It's a really good question, because in our Protect strategy, the old-fashioned way of doing business where we just bought stuff, we didn't really have to convince anyone other than our supporters. So we could just do it because we wanted to.
Right.
So that was fine. And by and large, I think we were pretty smart and we did smart things. But now in this transform strategy, we're asking governments and businesses to invest real money in nature. This is what my book is about, to obtain these benefits that nature provides, clean water or protection from storms. And so then we need this. So if you imagine an engineer or a government or a company considering an investment in infrastructure, that engineer has really good evidence and data. So if we want instead to ask them to invest in nature, we need comparably good data. So that's why we're doubling down on science to develop that data. And it turns out it's not that hard to do, but it takes some work and some time. So we look for data, number one. And then number two, when we've got the data, then we publish in peer-reviewed journals. That's important because, like everything these days, everything is controversial. So if we just say it works, lots of people will call it fake news, I suppose.
Well, no,
so
you would
learn,
and you could learn something from it too.
Right. So we need that seal of approval from scientists, and then we spread the word because, again, although we're big, we can't scale it fast enough to have the impact we want, and time's not on our side. So that's mostly what we try to do: great pilots, document the science, and spread the word and get others besides TNC to do this themselves. And working with the private sector is really good there. So like a lot of engineering firms and consulting firms are very friendly with us right now because they're more or less taking our intellectual capital. So then my board challenged me. They said, shouldn't we be monetizing that intellectual capital? But we argued no, because that would take longer, and we're not a business anyway, but what we have to do is spread these best practices as fast as we can.
So I'm thinking, listening to these great ideas that you and your people have, we're currently in the United States talking about a gigantic coast-to-coast infrastructure redo. We've kind of sat back for an awful long time in our country, and our roads are crumbling, our bridges are crumbling, and anyone who lives in New England and drives through the greater Boston area can see that. So I read, either in your book or something else that you wrote, that in Massachusetts and New York, you have a project going to work and revamp the grid in a way that is more environmentally friendly.
Yes.
And saves money.
Yes.
And tell us about that. How does that work? How do you invest in that?
Yeah, this is a little bit new for us. So traditionally, we've just been protectors of nature. But in the last number of years, we've become very concerned about climate change. So we want to do everything we can to address climate change, including energy-related issues. And then some people say, well, why are you doing that? There are other organizations who have energy expertise, which is true. So we, for example, have a really ambitious partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, because that's sort of been their spot. But what we bring to this is in every state, because we're in all 50, we have a board of trustees. So I have red states and blue states, just like the Congress does. And so we're trying to help the country, state by state, understand you can have nonpartisan, pragmatic conversations about how to address climate change. Now, in each state, it's got its own, and then at a time when it's hard to get anything done in DC, which it is right now, let's make as much progress as we can at the state level. So then different states have different opportunities. In New York and Massachusetts right now, both states are very interested in modernizing their grid.
Right.
And by that we mean, I'm not really an expert in this, but the common sense explanation would be, you pay for your energy, you pay the same price no matter when you use it. That's sort of silly because we have surplus energy at some times and energy deficits at other times. And could we encourage people by having smart meters that let them know the current cost of energy? They could use less when it was dear, more when it was less dear, et cetera, these kinds of things. As we have more and more rooftop solar, can the system absorb more independently provided energy? These kinds of things. The outcomes should be lower costs, less greenhouse gas emissions, better reliability, things everybody should be for. It's been a little bit of a political quagmire, but there's lots of reasons to think. I mean, sometimes bad news is good news. So, New York, in our view, has really good leadership on environmental matters, and they view this as a no-brainer. And now it's a little bit complicated, so they're great, team.
Well, aside from changing how you price it, what are they thinking?
That's a biggie. The biggie is making it possible for consumers to be smarter, not just homes, manufacturers too. Charge less when you have surplus energy, charge more when it's really dear. You think about too, like solar and wind, the critics all say, well, you can't store those sources of energy, although storage is improving.
You can't store enough of it.
Yes, but it's improving. But in any event, though, when it's abundant, then energy could be lower cost, and then you could help manufacturers who use huge amounts of energy manage their production schedules to produce more at those moments in time. Again, I'm not really an expert here, but it is that kind of common sense intervention. What we're bringing to the table is we can produce Republicans and Democrats, leaders of all parties, of all types in each state to advocate for that.
Yeah, let's go back to climate change and the Paris Accords. Did you think that was a good idea that the Trump administration pulled out?
No. I think history will be really kind to President Obama and Secretary Kerry here, and I think all Americans should be proud of them. The leadership that those two gentlemen provided and their broad teams was enormously important. So the U.S. has been a laggard on global climate change matters for a long time. We don't have to debate that now. I mean, the past is past. But President Obama, especially in his second term with Secretary Kerry, really decided to address it. Step one was they got China in the game, so China had also been a bit of an outlier. China and the U.S. had a big bilateral commitment. That then led to India getting in the game, Brazil and Indonesia upping their commitments, and all of that led to the successful Paris Climate Accord. Nothing made me prouder as an American citizen than the Paris Climate Accord. This might be the hardest thing humankind has ever had to do, address climate change. We can only do it on a global basis. It's hard because fossil fuels have been, if you chart the index for like human well-being over our history, it kind of plods on like this, and then fossil fuel is discovered, and everything soars. So transitioning from fossil fuel is not that easy. So I think the Paris Climate Accord was great. Doesn't mean it addressed everything, although it addressed a lot. And the whole world came together, really a beautiful thing. So then President Trump, we're a nonpartisan organization. It's not as easy to be nonpartisan sometimes as we would like, but we want to work if we can with the Trump administration. But we think the Paris decision was hugely misguided. I wrote a blog, it was easy to write. We think the Paris Climate Accord is hugely in America's best interest. Now, why are we especially concerned? The way it works is all these countries came together, made voluntary commitments. So then some people say, well, it isn't even a contract or a treaty. Everything is voluntary. Well, yes, everything is voluntary because the reason the US didn't sign up for the Kyoto Accord was it wasn't voluntary, and that was the reason the opponents didn't agree. But it's a voluntary commitment with real teeth. And I think it's reasonable to expect that the countries expect to live up to their commitments. And in the next few years, already China and India are ahead of schedule. I'll come back to that. But importantly, the idea really is then that these countries will come together every few years. There's a schedule, see how we're doing, and kind of up the commitments, which is really important. So without the US's leadership in that process, that's a source of concern. But there's some good news. I don't want to be too pessimistic. One thing we always lamented about climate is it's never in the news. It's not a high enough priority issue for Americans. That seems to be no longer the case. The only countries who are not in the Paris Climate Accord right now, I think, are the US, because of this decision, Syria, and Nicaragua. That's it. And by the way, Nicaragua is not in because they don't think it's ambitious enough. So then, that becomes news, and I think your average, good citizen in America with common sense now says, wait a second, this doesn't sound right, that it should be us in Syria. So climate's now in the news. That's good. And then you see also in the news that states and mayors and businesses have doubled down and upped their commitment even further. That's good. And now China, since Paris, China said in the Paris Accord their emissions would peak in 2030. And there were some critics saying about that, that's more or less business as usual. I thought it was better than that. But anyway, since then, China has already said coal will peak in 2020, and their emissions will peak in something like 2022. And by the way, China does what they say they will do in their 5-year plans. And India has, again, already increased their commitment. So I think it's a sad day for America that we've dropped out of our leadership role on what is likely one of, or maybe will even be the biggest issue humankind has to address. But we can do it otherwise in America at the state and city and business level. The rest of the world's stepping up their game. And it's in the news, and I don't think we'll ever be out of the news again. And ultimately, I think Americans are pretty smart. So hopefully, this will precipitate us getting our act together.
Just from a layman's point of view, and from my point of view as a reporter for many years, there are people who don't seem to be wackos who present scientific evidence to show that this discussion about global warming, for example, is debatable in this sense, that it isn't all man-made. It isn't all from the carbon and so forth. And then there's a group that says, well, 95% of it is. And so you have this tug of war going on.
I've heard about this.
It's the same.
Tug of war, I think, is unfair characterization. There's like a huge group of scientists over here. They'd win the tug of war fast. And then there's a couple people over there. So it's not, the problem with that metaphor is it suggests 50-50. Let me respond to this. So I mentioned President Lincoln, right? He was a smart president. He is the person who formed the National Academy of Science because he anticipated from time to time in our country there would be tough scientific issues that the country would have to grapple with. And so the National Academy of Science is a who's who of America's best scientists. It's very hard to get in it, and there are all kinds of rules to make sure it's not held hostage by anybody that does anything that's not objective. I know that we have we're so proud at TNC, we have 4 members of the Academy on our board, and our chief scientist, who is not even an American, is on the board. But it's our country's best scientists. And I even checked this today, thinking the question might come up. But they say the fact that the climate is warming and that it's mainly due to humankind, is unequivocal, as close to a fact as it can be. That's our best scientists. But then you might say, well, I don't believe in American scientists. That would be a sad observation. But then the UN organized the IPCC, the International, what does that stand for? International, anybody know? Anyway, it's the equivalent. Yeah, thank you. I have a weakness for these things. And now they've studied this so many darn times. It's a who's who of the world's best scientists. The same language, unequivocal. So it does sort of anger me when there are definitely demagogues out there who suggest that there's a debate. There are definitely some scientists out there who don't buy it. But the way science works is there's a peer-reviewed process. This thing has been peer-reviewed like crazy over and over again. And so there you have it. I mean, I think the science is pretty clear.
Okay, what do you think is your biggest obstacle to getting what you want to get done all around the globe? Is it?
Well, I think we're on it. Climate change is the toughest issue.
No, think bigger here. Lack of information. Is it business against? Is it a zero-sum game?
No. Okay, so
let me give you an example. Well, no, go ahead.
I can respond.
No, go ahead.
So I was interviewed by the Inky Mirror before this. Great young reporter. And her first question was, what's the story with business right now? Is business like opposed to environmental progress? I said, no.
No, it's not.
There are almost no smart business leaders who are opposed to smart environmental protection. I mean, it sounds like quite a grand statement to make, but it's more or less black and white.
I think most people know
the business
that,
leaders are with us. By the way, and then we should talk about climate change because there's no other issue as tough. I grew up in Cleveland, so as a kid in the 70s, Cleveland's environment was so bad. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire. All the trees in our backyard died. However, President Nixon was president. We passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We created the EPA. And if you go to Cleveland today, the air is, well, it's the only reason we have clean air here today. Most environmental issues, if you make your mind up to do it, you can turn things around quickly. Climate's not like that. These greenhouse gases last certainly more than 100 years. And it's a global problem. And a lot of it is irreversible. So climate is way harder. So then what are the challenges in climate? Well, we just have to face facts. It's hard. We have poor countries like India, where people's per capita carbon emissions are trivial compared to Americans, and they still need to grow to lift people out of poverty. We have those kinds of challenges. We have the free rider challenge. And then we have this annoying challenge about people trying to deny the science, although this is mostly a US challenge. If you travel around the world, the rest of the world thinks we're crazy. So what's going on in the US? There are a few things. There are some people who just hate government, and they fear that addressing climate has to mean big government, although that's not true. You can do it in market-based ways. There are some people in the industry who don't want to address climate change, but even Exxon has now signed up to be our partner in the Climate Leadership Council, so that's going away. And then in America, we have this weird thing of tribalism. That's what academic, social scientists are now calling it.
What is it?
Well, what it means is, this is not my area of expertise, but what it means is when people object to addressing climate, it isn't that they're really objecting to climate. They're a member of a tribe that is psychologically they're just against those people who want to address climate. So we have to get a little bit smarter in our communications. I mean, it's hard for me to be sympathetic to any of this. However, a vast majority of Democrats believe climate should be addressed in this country. A vast majority of self-described moderate Republicans want to address climate. So we're making progress. And then, of course, people have ears and eyes and common sense. They're noticing heat waves. They're noticing droughts. They're noticing Hurricane Sandys. If you're a traveler and if you go to Glacier National Park, it's very sad. Glaciers are almost gone. I mean, things are happening. If you go to places like China and India, there's no climate denialism. So it's a little bit of,
You mentioned,
I don't mean to get heated or anything, but I used to be more patient on these questions. But here's what smart people have to do. They have to engage. This is what I ask our trustees in red states. This is hard. So we have great people who are volunteer leaders of TNC in places like Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. These are not states where it's popular to talk about climate change. And we ask those volunteer leaders to now do that. And
why is that? Why is it hard to
Because
talk?
those are places where I guess it's this tribalism thing again. People just, they've been trained. Look, I'm sympathetic for people. I mean, it's a little bit awkward. We have in America, lofty elected officials who, I'm not going to name anybody. We're nonpartisan, but they bring in a snowball to the Congress and on a snowy day and say they mock climate change. But we have to be less tolerant of that. Again, if you look up the National Academy of Science for their latest climate study, you'll see them say that. This is unequivocal and as close to a fact as it can be. Anyway, I don't want to go on.
I would like to, well, I
On
would.
that issue, I get a little heated because we've been patient for
You
too
think?
long, I think.
Well, here's an example you might take a look at. We are familiar with here in Nantucket. There's been this issue of building a wind farm in Nantucket Sound. And while people generally are not opposed to wind energy, the objection primarily, as I understand, is into the location of the wind farm. The Nantucket Sound has a ferry system going back. You've got sailboats coming and going. It's a recreational area. So the objection is, don't put it here. Put it somewhere where we're not going to have issues. We got airplanes flying at 1,000 feet, and this just doesn't. The location doesn't make sense. And then what you hear from people like yourself, although I don't know, I asked you about it in the hallway, I kind of heard that, that you might be sympathetic to the location. And Wayne, who's here, who heads up the Massachusetts part of the Conservancy, let me see if I can ask this without getting your ire up.
No, you're not getting. I get the question. So it's a very good question, and by the way, it extends to all forms of infrastructure. America has gotten very good at stopping stuff, and we have to get over this. So the Nature Conservancy wants to
Unless you're going to stop it for a good reason. And
No, that's right. So
that's my point.
So that's right. So all these things are trade-offs. If you're a person who wants to live in a pure world or a black and white world, this is the wrong place.
It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
So all this stuff needs to be studied and assessed, but it has to be done so quickly, and it has to be done objectively. And so easier said than done. I'm a little suspicious of always what happens on these things, renewable energy is proposed, and people are against it, and they're against it for good reasons, and we just have to dig in and figure it out. We need more renewable energy. Offshore wind could be huge.
Everybody agrees. Yeah.
And so it just has to be studied, and TNC wants to be in that business. I mean, it's all going very slowly because the U.S. has just stopped building infrastructure. You know, here, President Trump, I think, could be a hero if he gets his act together. Early in his, right after the election, he had a meeting at the White House, and he was there. Vice President Pence was there. All the big shots in the Trump team were there, and TNC was there because they had come to understand that we believed in green infrastructure. This is what I wrote in my book. When you make investments in infrastructure, green can often outperform gray, and to their credit, they were quite receptive to that. And then the other thing you need to do is you need a fast, at least relatively fast way of assessing the trade-offs and making good decisions. The challenge is it's very easy for people to block stuff in their backyard, and that's in large part what's led to this standstill. We've got to get past that.
And, you know, compromise is everything, of course.
Yes.
And sometimes people can see environmentalists as intransigent.
Yep.
We say we want to do wind,
right.
we're going to do wind. We don't care if it hurts the sailboats or the ferry boats.
We haven't
and so
communicated
forth.
well.
Yeah, so you would agree that there's that. Let's not go into that too much more because we've got the time. And I
I'll try to
loved
be shorter.
your, I guess I read this in your book about after Hurricane Sandy, working with the government there to try to build an infrastructure where they could withstand storms better.
Yeah.
I didn't get the detail of that. How do you do that?
Well, in New York, New York isn't the best example. So New York is very vulnerable to sea level rise and storm, and Hurricane Sandy demonstrated that. And there's nothing saying there won't be a Hurricane Sandy next month.
But how would you protect?
But New York is rich, and there are so many valuable assets to protect. So New York has advantages that other places won't have. And so they're developing really sophisticated plans to protect New York City. What we argued for is green infrastructure needs to be a big part of that. And the very good leadership of New York City and New York State agrees with us. So there will be a lot of green infrastructure, dunes, coastal ecosystems of all kinds to provide protection. But it won't only be coastal ecosystems because that would be impossible. I mean, lower Manhattan is really in harm's way. So there'll be elaborate man-made infrastructure too. And New York is on it. But that doesn't have that much application anywhere else because New York has such enormously valuable assets at risk that they'll make those investments. But this is a problem all over the world, and it's a very good reason why we better address climate change. And already in places, in low-lying coastal places in the developing world, communities are being hurt all the time, and this will be a source of. I read in the news, there was a story in the New York Times last week. It was an extraordinary story. This wasn't the point of the story, but it was about refuge. It's such a sad story. It was refugees from Kenya and Somalia fleeing, of all places, to Yemen. Why were they fleeing? Because of climate-related challenges, mostly drought. And then the sea captain killed these refugees along the way. That was what so be prepared for a lot of stories like that if we don't get on with addressing climate.
So do you think that one of the keys in using renewable energy, such as wind and solar, is finding a way to store it for longer? Because obviously when the sun doesn't shine, you don't have any energy in your solar. When the wind doesn't blow, the windmills don't. So is the key in storing it for when you need it, or is there some other key to?
Well, the first thing is we just need to build more and more of it, because in fact it is sunny and windy often.
But not all the time.
Not all the time, that's right, but enough of the time that it can
No
have
one's
it.
going to give up their lights on the days it's not
No,
sunny.
that's right. Then that's where the smart grid comes in too. So yeah, and then in the meantime, storage is improving hugely. But
So
that
that's
point
the
of
key, storage? Do you
No,
think?
I wouldn't say that's the key. That's
No?
one key. It's all complicated. But no, we need to get on with things like Cape Wind. And if Cape Wind needs to be relocated, I don't happen to know, then let's get that done and relocate it. We need to get on with, the world, carbon emissions globally will have to peak by something like, when will they have to peak? 2050 or something?
That's what you
That
wrote,
would
yes.
mean the developed world will have to reduce its emissions by something like 80% or more by then. If we don't do that, again, you can look at this National Academy of Science or IPCC report. We're in for a hell of a lot of climate change. So we've got to reduce carbon emissions. That means use less energy. Conservation's the best thing to do. And then use renewable energy. And so we got to get on with building renewable energy. And yes, we have to get on with storage. But I'm pretty optimistic. If you look at the history, again, I used to be a Wall Street guy. Nobody expected the price of solar to plunge like it has. So the great technicians are on this, but that's not all that's needed. Then we believe we need a price on carbon. Right now, fossil fuel energy gets a huge discount, and so the playing field isn't level, and so that we'd be for that too.
I'm going to open this up for questions in just a second, but there's just one example that I read that I loved about in Florida, where the coral reefs are disappearing in some areas, sometimes due to man, but I don't know about equally, but also due to algae and other things that are already in the water. So how does that work from your investment point of view? You're talking about let's invest in nature, getting private equity to give many dollars.
There's a cool.
How does it work in that case?
Well, here's a cool one I'll mention because it's on my mind. I was just in London 2 weeks ago at this big insurance conference, all the insurance CEOs of the world, and we announced with Swiss Re, our partner is Swiss Re, in Cancun. I know Cancun is maybe not every environmentalist's favorite place, but it's an important tourism destination for the Mexican economy, and it benefits right now from a decent coral reef. That coral reef acts like a seawall. That coral reef also is what attracts tourists there. They like to snorkel and dive. That coral reef also, harbors biodiversity. Fish spawn there, birds are there, et cetera. So this is a really precious resource. So we're about to do an insurance policy. I don't know, there's probably insurance people here, a so-called parametric insurance policy. So in the event of certain storm or wind circumstances, the insurance will pay out. There's no negotiation like there is between me and my insurance company if there's a storm that hurts my house here. And the funds go directly to immediate restoration of the coral reef. So we'll have an ongoing program to continually reinvest in the coral reef so it doesn't get degraded badly. Good for nature, good for the economy because that coral reef attracts tourists, and then importantly, it's a seawall, providing protection from storm and sea level rise. And the business community is ready to sign up. Swiss Re is ready to write that policy. The government's a little bit involved too because the government's the owner of the beach itself, and that's at risk. And those three parties have decided, again, nature's a good investment.
So those three parties would buy insurance?
So the government and the business community will buy the insurance. The insurance will pay out in the event of certain windstorms, and 100% of the proceeds go to restoring the coral reef. That's pretty cool, don't you think? Philanthropic need is zero. All we need is some money for TNC types to be out there developing this stuff. And then you can imagine that should scale. So I wrote a little blog on that, and I also put on the internet my speech, And they got a lot of attention. Air New Zealand interviewed me this weekend about that. I mean, Air New Zealand, Radio New Zealand. So people are interested. This is a reason to be encouraged. People are interested in these pragmatic, business smart ways to address challenges. There's no blaming anybody. It's just getting people together and coming up with programs that make sense.
And
Getting on with
I
it.
think people are receptive to programs that make sense. Can we have any questions here? Okay.
I'm assuming automobile emissions in the United States are the biggest contributor to the greenhouse effect. Or
They're not. They're number 2.
okay.
Power is number 1.
Okay. So just commenting on this, I live in New Jersey, and we have a horrendous situation with our infrastructure there with New Jersey Transit, rail systems, trying to get through the tunnels into Manhattan. And commuters, takes 3 hours to get in the city. So they are now driving. Our roads are already so clogged, like a lot of other cities in the United States.
Like Nantucket in
How do
August.
comments on that? How do we, I mean, New York and New Jersey are fighting over it. And
Yeah, could everybody hear the question? The question is, what do we do about cars and their transportation and their greenhouse gas emissions? And the specific example is New Jersey. It's driving to Manhattan every day, and the trains are overcrowded and bad, and the tunnels are full, and it's a sad story. Now, this frustrates me a little bit too. Mayor Bloomberg, God bless him, and when he first became mayor, he proposed a big commuter tax. If you, and it would vary. Like on the weekend, it wouldn't be that high. But if you had to drive a car to New York City, you'd pay a big tax. London has this. And that would encourage more people to take public transportation. It would ease the congestion in New York City. And the deal was going to be 100% of the proceeds were going to be reinvested in public transportation. Hard for me to think of a smarter policy where everybody would win. And there was too much political opposition, both in New York and New Jersey, to it. I think it was bad leadership by those politicians. They portrayed it as a scheme that would hurt, middle class and lower middle class commuters. But lower class and middle class commuters are probably already using public transportation, and it's not very good. And if you wanted to drive into Manhattan, you'd be able to. You'd have that free choice, but you'd pay for it, and public transportation would be improved. So I hope we can get back to that. Again, America has really been bad at building infrastructure. We've got to overcome that. Then we're for a carbon tax because we think it's obvious to us that gasoline prices are too low if you consider the environmental harm they do. And we've had real-life experience with this. If you're my age, you'll remember the OPEC events. So OPEC imposed a carbon tax. Now, it wasn't a very good one for us. All the proceeds went to OPEC, not to us. But it felt like a tax. And by the way, it was imposed rudely. It was a huge tax very quickly. We could ratchet up gradually over time, so it'd be smoother. But even in America, the economy got hit, and then everybody adjusted. People started putting, I grew up in a humble part of Cleveland. Everybody put cellophane in their windows so insulation would be improved. People started buying smaller cars. And the economy resumed growth very quickly. We could do that ourselves, and then those tax revenues would be ours. We could lower taxes. We could dividend those taxes back to citizens. There are all kinds of people who want to reduce corporate taxes today. We could do that. All of you who studied Econ 101 will remember we're supposed to tax things we want to discourage, not encourage. We tax work. No, we want to encourage work. We could tax use of fossil fuels and reinvest those proceeds in these. We have to get on with doing those kinds of things. I think you can be encouraged by electric cars. That's exciting. Good work by the private sector. It will be better, though, if we've transitioned our power from, to cleaner sources of power, and that's underway. So there's reason to be encouraged.
Other questions? Yes.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the tribalism you spoke about, or what I would call maybe identity politics.
Yeah.
Particularly as you're looking for market stations or capital that might be in these red states, how are you trying to kind of bridge that polarity that currently exists?
Thank you. The question was about tribalism or polarism or partisanship in the US. I'm actually pretty encouraged. Now, I live in D.C., so I'm rarely encouraged in D.C. itself about this. Things are quite bad there. But part of my job is to visit every state in the U.S. We have chapters in every state. So recently, I've been upping my game in red states because we need them involved. And, I think it's just the case that most Americans are good people. They have common sense, and they want to do the right thing. The problem I think we have is, and environmentalists have screwed up a lot here. Environmentalists, I think, have made some colossal mistakes vilifying or mocking people who don't agree with us. Obviously, that's not very well received. And then new forms of media don't help. I think we need to be worried about social media. So without even trying, your Facebook feed is going to be slanted to your views. That's not so good. And then I think political leadership in DC hasn't been that good recently. But as soon as I shift my attention to the state level, it's much, much better. Even in those red states I mentioned. And at the city level, it's much better. And then I think all this bad news is getting people's attention too. Like people are noticing things are a little off course. You can't commute to New Jersey. We have all these storms. It's just us in Syria that quit the Paris Climate Accord. Americans aren't stupid. And so I think we're going to get through. At the Nature Conservancy, we're doing everything we possibly can to continue to be nonpartisan, to find common ground, to not vilify. So that's what we're doing. Sometimes I go to colleges and talk and see people say, what can I do? And so we want to urge young people to get into these fields and keep that in mind. You know, don't get on your bully pulpit and start preaching and criticizing, but try to be a person who finds common ground. I think business is a pretty good ally here. So there's some reason to be encouraged, but it's going to take real work. The only reason I think I've learned something about this is my job requires me to go to Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi. If it didn't, I probably wouldn't go to those places so much. So it's kind of sad. In America, we don't mix it up like we used to. I hope we will do that again.
But don't you find, too, that Americans, when they're given some specific guidance, respond? I remember back in the 70s when we had the gas lines and you couldn't buy gasoline and we were having water issues. And there were recommendations from people like yourself and others in government to say, for example, when you're brushing your teeth, you don't leave the water running the whole time. On a much bigger scale, think of recycling. Most Americans I know are very happy to throw whatever in this bag and that bag and that bag and bring back the bottles and so forth. So
those are good examples. They're kind of small ones. And what's really missing in action is enlightened government leadership.
But I want to ask, let me finish this question.
I promise. Well, no, I'm sorry, but this is again important. Sorry.
But you're going. That wasn't the question.
Well, no, but anyway, okay. but I'm still responding to this question. The biggest ask I have of you, anyone I ever talk to, is please engage in politics. It turns out democracy takes more work than we realized, and Americans, I think, have gotten complacent. And at the federal level, state level, city level, local level, we've got to be engaged. Because most of these challenges we're talking about, voluntary actions are insufficient. We need smart policy. So as much as you recycle and turn your water off, good, but I'm not that impressed. We need smarter policy, and I don't think we're going to get it without citizens engaging. And I don't really blame our elected officials that much. I think they're mostly trying to do what they think their voters want them to do. So we all have to up our game. Sorry.
Are there other questions? Didn't you just ask a question? Wait, let me get someone else. Did you not? No, you didn't. I'm sorry. I mixed the two of you up. I apologize.
I'm interested in how the Nature Conservancy is reacting to the sale of our national park.
Well, we're hugely opposed. I guess we're not opposed. The question is, there's all this talk in D.C. now about selling off federal land. So naturally, we've worked really hard to make those purchases all happen. We've always been advocates for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This was a really good idea, decades old, rarely enforced like it's supposed to be. But the idea was, since the government allows mineral and energy extraction on federal-owned land, that money should be reinvested in buying such land. It's never been fully funded. We're always fighting for it. We're opposed to crazy sell-offs. How we're going to do it? Back to politics. We can't do it by ourselves. I go to Capitol Hill. They say, yeah, of course you're for this, Mark. You're an environmentalist. I show up with voters from that state, and then they start paying attention. So it's up to us as citizens. It's totally in the hands of the Congress and our president. We've got to let them know what a priority is. There's no other way to do it. There's no magic solution, except we do live in a democracy, so we have to get to work. We're doing everything we can to mobilize that advocacy and engagement. And I wouldn't be too discouraged. I actually think that's a good example. If we could, only 60% of Americans voted in the last election. If we could up that to 65%, probably, it'd be a very different world. And I think we can even do better. So I think we should all find that as kind of energizing. We as citizens can make important things happen.
Are there other questions? We're at 6 o'clock. We'll take one or two more. Yes, sir. Yes.
There's kind of like two sides of the kind of the carbon level in the atmosphere at this point. One is obviously reducing carbon emissions by virtue of reducing them, carbon tax or whatever. Other side is kind of scrubbing, kind of cleansing the atmosphere, oceans of carbon. Has TNC given any thought to the scrubbing idea or any investments that?
Well, we're
Would you repeat the question?
the question is there's two sides to the coin on climate. There are emissions, which we've been talking about, and mostly fossil fuel related. And there are others, though, like bad farming practices and these kinds of things. But nature itself is a carbon sink. Is that what you were talking about? And so we're hugely into this. So we've concluded that as much as 1/3 of what the Paris Climate Accord calls for in emissions reductions can be accomplished on a cost-effective basis by massive restoration of nature. So all over the world, there are forests, but other ecosystems too, that sadly have become degraded. We can restore them. Now, how to pay for it is a tricky question. We can restore them. They'll sequester carbon and be a huge tool in addressing climate. But they'll also be habitat for biodiversity. They'll protect watersheds. They'll be places for recreation. They'll be good for local communities, starting with the Amazon rainforest. But it's true for mangroves. It's true for all ecosystems. So it's another reason to be a little bit optimistic. So what we want to do is, just like 15, 20 years ago, there was kind of a revolution in terms of awareness of renewable energy. We want a similar revolution in new business models to restore nature at scale. And lots of great organizations are working on it. I wouldn't say it will be easy, but I'm, again, kind of cautiously optimistic. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I guess one thing I wanted to add to that is, are there any kind of man-made solutions that don't involve deforestation?
Then there are man-made solutions. Now, this gets quite controversial if you're referring to geoengineering. So the idea now is, for example, when there's a really big volcano, that volcano acts, those particles in the air reduce heat coming into our planet and can be a tool to address climate change. Most scientists and most environmentalists are a little queasy about screwing around with the ecosystem like that. My own observation is we better get on with making progress in climate change because some of those interventions aren't that expensive. And the impacts of climate change are very uneven. Life's just not fair. Like in the US, we'll be relatively less hurt by climate change than other countries. China, on the other hand, is really vulnerable to climate change. And so you could imagine a country being disproportionately hurt, making these kind of geoengineering investments unilaterally, and ecosystems and weather patterns really being screwed up. So there are a lot of smart scientists on it. Makes me nervous. But again, it's like all these it's like infrastructure again. We better study it. And then again, we're going to need good global governance. And again, I think it's regrettable that President Trump dropped out of the Paris Climate Accord because we're going to need more global leadership to engage in these kinds of issues wisely.
I'll take one more question. Yes.
Mark,
I'd
hi.
I'd actually just like to find out a little background about the foundation itself. I'm seeing the envelope here, and I'm assuming a lot of people here donate and are members of the thing. But the lion's share of your money comes from, and what's the breakdown?
Oh, thank you for asking. So we have an endowment, so we don't have to, but we have to raise every year more than $600 million just to keep the lights on. As a former business person, I have to tell you, that is really daunting. And it kind of blows my mind. We run ourselves like a global professional service firm. It reminds me of Goldman Sachs. We've got really bright, hardworking people all over the world working their butts off. But we have no revenue. We do it as a nonprofit. By and large, that's due almost entirely to the generosity of American donors. Some very rich people, lots of people who aren't rich at all. God bless them. They just care about our mission. They respect our organization, and they give us money. Now, we're trying to grow that with international donors. We've had good success in China, Brazil, Colombia. We rely on some foundations. We get some government grants, not that many. And then, as I mentioned, we're trying to use non-philanthropic capital, too. But I'm glad you asked, because one of my pitches to any audience I speak to, too, is please support nonprofits in the environmental space. If you want to support TNC, great, but you can support others too. On Nantucket, I mentioned this, I think. We've got great conservation organizations, and we need them all. Sometimes people say to me, aren't there too many environmental nonprofit organizations? I say, oh my God, no. It is a big world. There's a lot of work to do. We do collaborate and cooperate with one another, but we're all under-resourced. We're a big one, we're under-resourced. There are small ones we're under. If we want to do anything new, we have no untapped money. We've got to go raise more money. So our 65-year track record, we're so proud of it, is due solely to generous Americans. I'm sure many people in this room support nonprofit organizations in many fields, including the environment. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Please keep it up and spread the word.
So does most of the money from this global organization come from America?
Yeah, America has really
What
paid
about
for the
other
bulk
countries?
of it. Well, we're on it. You know, America has a better philanthropic tradition than other countries. It should make us all proud. Our China program, which is huge and successful, is now 100% funded from Chinese, mostly business leaders, and they're now a net funder of work outside China. That's our biggest success. We're proud of it. Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, India, good fundraising success, but those programs aren't yet self-sufficient. But we're on it. And, there are good people all around the world, and we're going to do our best to make them philanthropists too. But America is rather unique, and Americans should be proud of it. And right here in Nantucket, it's a tremendous record of success. Almost half the island is in conservation, and it's really well maintained. It's extraordinary. And so anybody who comes here enjoys that, so we should continue to support those great organizations. TNC really admires them.
Well, one of the beautiful things about Nantucket, I think, and I've been coming here since the early 70s, is that we come here because we love this place. And so we do tend to take care of it, and we do tend to take care of each other. And we appreciate people like you coming to give us new ideas. And that was where my question was going.
We have time. What was your question? I feel rude.
Well, no, I just wanted to leave people with some direction from you.
Oh.
You said these little projects aren't so big, they have to get involved politically. Well, that's a big thing. How do I get involved politically? I should vote for something and contribute a buck here or there. Is there anything else you can impart to
What could you
Obviously,
do?
everyone
Yeah,
here
what
is
can
very
you do?
interested.
I was serious. The first ask is please engage politically. For sure, vote. For sure, be engaged. Financially support the leaders you respect. Stay in touch with them. Yeah, be as active as you can be politically. Americans have gotten a little bit lazy about that, and we need to turn that around. And inculcate that sense of citizenry in young people, whether they're your kids or your nieces or nephews or whatever. But Americans have to get more engaged in politics. That's number one. Number two, if you're a business person, there are a lot of business people who come to Nantucket. For 9 years now at TNC, and for those 3 years at Goldman when I was the environmental guy, I've looked for businesses, help businesses find win-win opportunities. Do the right thing for nature, it strengthens your businesses. I'm batting 1,000. There's not one business I haven't found. So either as an investor or as an executive, push your business to do the right thing. I mentioned supporting environmental nonprofits. TNC welcomes your support, but there are many great ones. Support them. And then back to young people, we have one other challenge. This is worrisome. We're a geeky organization. Our scientists tell us that young kids today spend less than 1/3 the time outdoors than my generation did when we were young. And most of our supporters who are adults, if you ask them how they became environmentalists, their story's not like mine. It was when they were kids. So we've got to inculcate in young people today respect and awareness of the outdoors. And so again, as parents, as teachers, as uncles and aunts, we've got to get kids outside. They got to get out. They've got to get outside. I mean, that's my last guess.
Part of why they come to Nantucket. Thank you, Mark Tercek.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank Mark for his passion, his commitment to improving our environment. I can't think of a better person to be leading the Nature Conservancy. Mark's book, Nature's Fortune, is going to be on sale in the lobby. Mark's going to slip out in just a moment, so he'll be down there when you leave if you'd like to get a copy of his book. And I also want to sincerely thank Natalie for joining us tonight on her birthday. We really appreciate that. And thank you all for being here.